Good afternoon and greetings all. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We are in for a treat today. Dr. Janet Spillman, advocate, lifelong learning, with 6 professional quals, is a keen birder, bushwalker and weekend Mount Cootha weeder every week since 2004. She was a secondary school teacher both in regional Queensland and England. She has written 2 environmental histories, the history of Mount Cootha and the First World War engineers on the Palestine front. Today, she will acquaint us with Frederick Manson Bailey, Queensland Colonial Botanist, 1881 to 1915. The topic of her PhD awarded last year. It was my very good fortune, on the recommendation of Dr. Bill Metcalf here, to examine and recommend student number 302-31520 for her PhD. Welcome, Dr. Janet.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. I too acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagara people of the land where we meet. And I honour our First Nations people for their deep knowledge of Australian plants. This isn't just a story of one scientist. It's a story of the experts, the collaborators, the collectors, the taxonomists that he worked with. It's about the society he lived in. It's a story about how European immigrants responded to the rich biodiversity of Queensland. It's the story of how Bailey's work was shaped by the economic needs of Queensland as a colony. I'm going to tell you stories about plants. I'm going to tell you about acclimatizers, about poisonous plants. Wrong button. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the trees that he was passionate about, the grasses that he studied, weeds, poisonous plants, pharmaceutical plants, food plants, and best of all, decorative plants like ferns. Bailey was a member of a dynasty of botanists. His father, John, worked in London for one of the best nurseries in Europe. Lodgers imported plants from the New World. They studied them, they propagated them, and they sold them on. They introduced new plants to the world. But John Bailey left Britain in 1839, and he brought his family to South Australia. In South Australia, he was planning to start a farm, but the governor asked him to be the colonial botanist and to start a botanic gardens. So Manson Bailey, at the age of 12, finished his formal education, and he started collecting with his father in the Adelaide Hills 2 days after they arrived. He helped to dig the ground and to plant the plants that went into the botanic gardens. Unfortunately, South Australia had really bad economic problems, and Governor Gray made John Bailey redundant. He took up farming land and then returned to Adelaide to start a nursery where he continued importing plants that would be providing food, fibre, and woods needed by the community. Bailey loved plants. He was passionate about them. But it wasn't an easy life. He was always thrilled that he was allowed to do what he loved, but he was short of funds. His pay was very limited, and when he was Colonial Botanist, he didn't have access to the materials and to the reference books that he needed to do the job properly. So it was just another indignity added to difficulties when he was made redundant during the recession of 1893. The outcry was immediate. Kew Gardens intervened with the Queensland government. Scientists throughout Australia intervened and said, this isn't on. As for Bailey, he just said, look, this job's too important not to be done. They gave him access to his books, and he kept researching and writing about plants until he was reinstated at a lower salary, I might add. Again, during the Federation drought, it was suggested that he might like to retire. He said, no, not going to do that. So he decided that he would go on and keep working at a lower rate of pay again. But it was a difficult time, so he had to make changes. He moved in with his son, John, at John's house in the Botanic Gardens, not far from here, where the tea house is today. And it was pretty crowded, but they jogged along pretty well together. Here is Bailey, the family man, with two of his grandchildren, John's children. But there were other Baileys who were botanists as well. John Frederick Bailey, his son, was allowed to become his assistant, his paid assistant, in 1889, and Bailey trained him as a botanist, so that in 1905 he was appointed Botanical Gardens curator at the Botanical Gardens, which are nearby. In 1915, when Bailey died, John became botanist in his place, but he had to surrender the role of curator of the gardens. In 1917, John decided that gardens were scientific institutions, and he jumped at the offer to go back to Adelaide to be both colonial botanist and curator of the gardens, because he wanted to see the way plants were used and developed in a natural setting as they grew. When John became Gardens curator in 1905, Bailey had to find another assistant. Luckily, they breed them in the Bailey family. And his daughter Louisa had a son, Cyril Tennyson White, whose name is also revered in botanic circles in Queensland. C.T. White became Bailey's assistant. Bailey trained him, took him collecting, taught him how to collect, taught him how to read plants. And the best way of teaching C.T. White was to get him to draw the plants that were going to be illustrated in Bailey's books. C.T. White went on to become a forester, teaching forestry for the University of Queensland. But the family forester you need to remember is Bailey's grandson, Frederick Manson Bailey, who you saw as a kid in that other slide. He worked for the New South Wales Forestry Department, where he had a very illustrious career. His brother John became curator of the Toowoomba Botanic Gardens, and then, after World War II, of Brisbane Botanic Gardens. So the Bailey family are certainly very much part of Queensland's scientific history. Brisbane had two botanic gardens, and the reason for that was common across the whole of the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Dutch Empire. Every time a new colony was established, the centre of empire in London sent out a botanist to start a botanic gardens, to trial plants, imported plants and local plants, to see what would do in the climate. They had to make their colonies self-sufficient because colonies were plant-based economies. You couldn't eat without plants, because if you fancied a nice steak, that came from cattle or sheep, which ate plants. Transport was often by bullock wagon or by horse, which ate plants. If the plants weren't understood, you didn't have an economy, you didn't have a society. And in many ways, Bailey's work with plants tells us about the problems of creating a society in Queensland in colonial times. In 1861, when Bailey arrived in Brisbane, he opened a seed store. He went broke. But the Queensland Acclimatisation Society was on hand to offer him work. Now, the acclimatisation societies were established by imperial powers. In Queensland, it was Governor Bowen in 1862 who asked the Queensland government to set up the Queensland Society. He also got the Queensland government to provide land in Victoria Park, what we call Victoria Park now, where they built Bowen Park, the Acclimatisation Society Gardens. Now, originally, Walter Hill, who was the botanist at the Brisbane Botanic Gardens, worked very closely with the acclimatisers, but the tensions soon opened up. I won't take you through that story, but at the end of the day, the Acclimatisation Society put their money on Bailey, and they had good reason to. They valued his work. They thought he was a first-class botanist. They asked him to go up to the tip of Cape York, to Cairns, to collect plants. He brought back 12 cases of seeds and plants, which the society used to grow on in the gardens, and also for exchange with foreign acclimatisation societies. The Acclimatisation Society trialled plants like sugarcane. So did Walter Hill in the Botanic Gardens. They all trialled things like cabbages, mangoes, nuts, fruit. They were all in the business of finding out what would be a good doer in the Queensland climate, because acclimatisation was about adapting plants to the country by growing them and observing what soils and watering systems they needed. They asked Bailey to find plants that they couldn't get. So, for example, he got the Zante grape, which was grown on and hopefully would be used to start a wine culture in Queensland. They asked him to package up the plants that were going to be exchanged overseas, and he would have used the Wardian case, the glass case, put the plants in, seal them up so that they could arrive safe after a long sea voyage somewhere else in the world. His connection with the Acclimatisation Society put him in a powerful position. The acclimatisers were connected with all the naturalists in Australia, in Queensland, and around the world. They were constantly exchanging not just plant material, but information, knowledge about plants. And they were taking on board a lot of the ideas that were circulating around the world about plants. They were also connected with government. Louis Bernays was their leader for most of the second half of the 19th century, and he was a clerk at Parliament House. He was well placed to have the ear of government, and he and other people in the society were also involved in the newly formed Philosophical Society, which ultimately became the Royal Society of Queensland, which is the foremost scientific body in Queensland still today. So Bailey was in touch with these networks of people, and they respected him, and they fought a strong political battle to promote him and his position in society. In 1874, they actually got the government to appoint him as keeper of the herbarium. This was the start of the Queensland Herbarium, which you now see in the Mount Coot-tha Botanic Gardens. As keeper of the herbarium, Bailey's main task was taxonomy. Now, I've chosen a plant at random here, and Kew Gardens have kindly allowed me to show it to you. The Endiandra sankiana, F.M. Bailey, is a piece of card with a dried plant on it, and it tells a story. It's a historical document. Endiandra is a laurel. It's part of the laurel order of plants, but it was commonly known as a walnut, although it's nothing like the walnuts that we eat today. Sankiana was a name given as an honorific. It's an eponymy, a use of a person's name to actually signify that this is a separate species. So who was Sankey? Sankey was treasurer of the Royal Society. He was a member of the field naturalist groups that went collecting with Bailey, so he was a good mate. They'd gone back years. He was a jeweler. And if you've heard of Sankey's Scrub, which is part of White's Hill, he owned that land. So Sankey was somebody who was a keen naturalist, and Bailey honoured him in the name of this plant. Now, you probably can't read the writing at the top, but it shows the barcode, which enables Kew Gardens to get the information about the plant. It shows that it was collected at the Barron River by Edward Cowley. It shows that they received it in 1894. But I know, because we've got wonderful research engines for botany and science, I know that that Bailey first described this plant in 1893 in a botany bulletin. And that's how I know about Sankey. That's how I know about this plant. These things were written down. The trail of historical evidence is quite extraordinary. We know the history of plants. Forestry. Forestry was the hill that the acclimatizers chose to die on. Like all scientific bodies in the world in the late 19th century, they were worried about the indiscriminate cutting of timber trees. The process of industrialization meant that trees were disappearing, and in the process there was a lot of wastage. A lot were burnt or just left to rot on the ground. There was very little government control across the colonies of the world, and I'm not just talking about the British colonies, I'm talking about French, Dutch colonies. Very little control of the way plants were cut and used. And people were saying, we can't manage without trees, we need timber. But in their haste to clear trees to build towns, communities, farms, in their haste to clear the land for farming and to get access to the trees to build things, the settlers were allowed to let rip. The acclimatizers were concerned, and they drew on information and ideas that were circulating around the world. They called a conference in 1873 to discuss the problem. And I've chosen a few key people who delivered papers at that conference. John Douglas was the elected member of Maryborough, a timber town, where the timber merchants and the sawyers were worried that they were running out of timber. Walter Hill was the curator of the Botanic Gardens, and he'd had plenty of time to observe, as he went around collecting plants, to observe the disappearing forests. And he was angry about the wastage of timber. He made lists of trees, and alongside those names of trees, he wrote down the uses to which the trees could be put, because he believed that the wise use of trees would allow that resource to continue into the future. John Jardine, a member of a famous family of naturalists, was a naturalist himself. He was sent by the government to Somerset to start the settlement there, and he returned to Rockhampton before 1873 where he wrote a paper about the need to conserve forests for the conference. And in that paper, he said, trees are important for their beauty and their shade. Trees keep the soils fertile. They maintain our climate. Trees draw rainfall. And in this climate, you need rainfall. And he said, we are losing indigenous species before we even know what they are. John Jardine died before the Queensland government arranged the Select Committee, where they looked at this whole issue and took information from a lot of people, including Louis Bernays, who was the prime mover of this whole forest conservation movement. Louis Bernays said we need to have policies to restrict the cutting of timber. We need to have a survey of where the timber trees are, and we need to start replanting with native trees and imported trees. When Bailey fronted up to the Select Committee, it reads actually to me like a job interview. He was very politically canny. He didn't say, you've been doing it wrong all these years. He didn't say that the climate depended on trees being left. He said he worked in New Zealand, South Australia, Victoria, and he had never seen evidence that trees maintained rainfall, that trees drew rainfall. He said trees have many uses, and he had submitted, like Walter Hill, a list of trees and their uses. But he did say, if you want trees for the future, you need to conserve their use. He also said that there's plenty more timber up north, so nothing to worry about. In fact, during his life, up north was being felled. This is a picture, or a series of pictures from the Atherton tableland, where timber trees were felled for sale and to create space for farming and dairying. But Bailey's main love was grass. He loved grasses, and in 1875, he wrote a paper on Queensland grasses, where he talked about the grasses for different habitats, the grasses that did well for different reasons. And it was this paper that got him another job with government. At the time, the Australian pastoralists had moved very readily into vacant land, taking their flocks with them. And they let the flocks breed. And those flocks ate out the grass pastures. The fodder plants were disappearing. And when the fodder plants disappeared, the sheep started getting worm disease and dying. Well, this was the reason why the government took action. So they appointed a board into the diseases of plants and stock, which looked not only at grass, but also at sugarcane and other plants within Queensland that they were concerned about, plants which were being attacked by fungal disease, for example. So who did they know who knew a lot about grasses? Well, we all know the answer to that. It was Bailey. He published on the subject, so they employed him as their resident botanist. He went around Queensland, around the Mitchell and Maranoa districts, collecting grass plants and grass seeds. He brought them back and he gave them to the curators of botanic gardens to trial plants in grass beds so that people could see what plants were available. He actually rated Toowoomba's botanic gardens above all others because Edward Way not only had labelled all the plants accurately, and Bailey's job was to make sure that the labelling was accurate. Remember, this was a time when importers of grass seeds got the names on the bags wrong, which caused all sorts of problems. But he would go around checking that the names were right and writing up the results of this research. At the end of the day, the people who had sent grass seeds by post to Bailey and grass specimens had been written up in the local press, and they loved their interest being taken attention, the attention that they got, and they remained collectors for Bailey for the rest of his career as long as they could. Bailey won everybody's respect for the way he carried out these research into grasses. The problem is that the work of the board was very expensive. The government had given the board money to rent land at New Farm for some of its trial beds, and it decided to wrap up. And the board was quite happy with that, because they said people need to do their own research and find out what grasses work on their own land. The problem is that not everybody knew grasses the way the naturalists did. So Bailey got together with Carl Steiger, who was the government's analytical chemist. Carl Steiger invented a method of making electrotype prints, real-life nature prints of grasses, and they created a book of grasses. It was supposed to go to several volumes, but there was only ever one. The grasses are life-size. You don't actually get to see the roots and the full shape of the grasses, but you get to see the seed heads, which was enough for people to work out what grasses they were looking at. In 1887, the government opened a Department of Agriculture. Later on, it became the Department of Agriculture and Stock, when the work of Gordon, the Chief Inspector of Stock, was included within that structure. The Department of Agriculture and Stock opened a building which is actually very close to here, just downriver a little way. Bailey actually spent a lot of time in this area. The Department of Agriculture and Stock had a very key job to do. They had to modernise agricultural practice, and they had to diversify agriculture so that the Queensland economy would thrive. Bailey was the first employee after the Undersecretary for Agriculture, and he set up in this building. And in that building, he arranged his specimens in their neat little files in the filing cabinets, but he also arranged a museum of economic botany, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the Department of Agriculture and Stock actually set about this with determination. They opened extra state nurseries. They employed experts, and I'll be talking to you a lot about Benson, who was the fruit expert. They opened Gatton College. They published Bailey's work, and they gave it free, usually, to farmers. They subsidised exhibitions, they subsidised show societies, and they subsidised an annual conference. Now, not everybody took advantage of these learning opportunities, but it did advance agriculture in Queensland. This is the only image I can find of Bailey's Museum of Economic Botany. You can see rows of cabinets. What you can't see are the huge wooden doors at the entrance. Those doors and a lot of those exhibits came from the international shows, because Bailey was a commissioner of exhibitions for the Queensland government for botany. For his displays, he always produced a guidebook, and each of the items in his museum had a number, and people could look in the guidebook and see what that plant was and what its purpose was, what you could do with that plant. He also showed the process by which plants were used. So, for example, there would be cotton and pictures showing the process by which cotton became material. There was a fleece and pictures of the process by which the fleece became fabric. The problem is that 19th century museums and exhibitions believed in the pile 'em high and let everybody be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of what we've got. reading Bailey's catalogues is hard work because it's heavy on fact and very low on detail and explanation. The last international exhibition that took place in Australia was at Brisbane. This is the agricultural court, and you can see Bailey's jars of fruit pickled in spirits, as well as lots and lots of ferns, because he loved ferns. For the exhibitions, a major display was wood. I've mentioned the huge wooden doors around the entrance to the museum, but he also got pettigrews, who again are just downstream. Unfortunately, the only image I can get of that sawmill were taken during a flood. It's not very hopeful. But pettigrews had craftsmen who made planks, carved books, and carved veneers to show people what the woods looked like when they were used. The government print office, again, close by. At the print office, Bailey got to check his publications, that everything was word perfect, and frankly, I've never found an error. He was able to talk to the lithographers who took his sketches and turned them into beautiful images of plants, which enabled people to look at a plant and recognize it. And boy, did he write. When you look at the sheer volume of the books he read, I can tell you, as a student, I nearly gave up because he wrote so much. But bear with me, he repeated a lot of the things that he previously published. He was creating encyclopedias, updating them as more plants came in or as plant names were changed. Weeds. Okay, hand on heart, Bailey actually got it wrong with this one. In 1900, he put an article in the Queensland Agricultural Journal, and he said, the Florida yellow water lily is going to be the biggest menace to Queensland that you have ever seen. And he had a picture of a creek in America which was covered with this water lily. The floating roots of the plant show that it could set off offshoots and spread in the water. And he said, if this gets into our waterways, we're in for it. And he said, this is a bigger problem than the water hyacinth. Mm. Well, actually, he was contradicting William Souter, who 3 years earlier had put a feature in the Queensland Agricultural Journal about the water hyacinth. And he said, this is the biggest pest we're ever going to have to face. And he said, look at those roots. They float up to the surface and they put up shoots all along each root. And each of those shoots will put up more roots. And so the plant will spread across your waterways. He was right. In 1900, we've got Leslie Corrie, who was then president of the Acclimatisation Society. Oh, Souter was secretary of the Acclimatisation Society and curator at Bowen Park. He was an acclimatiser. So if you think that the acclimatisers are responsible for weeds, think again. He agreed with Souter. He said, this is the worst weed we're ever going to have to face. And he talked about the information that he'd received from the United States Department of Agriculture in one of its botany bulletins, how it clogged the riverways and the creeks, how boats could not move upriver, how people had to manually pull those plants out of the water, leave them on the bank, and when they were dry, burn them. If you managed to clear most of the weed and a flood came along, water hyacinth went out to sea and it didn't survive salt water. But most of the time it was left to do what it liked. And you can see the damage that it did. In Ipswich, merchants who weren't able to get their goods moving between Brisbane and Ipswich had to plead with the government to send men to pull the water hyacinth out. It's still one of the biggest weeds in Queensland, which is monitored very carefully. We keep it under control using herbicides, using biological controls, and mechanical removal. We take them out using machines. Bailey was wrong. He was right about the water lily, but he was wrong because the water hyacinth was worse. He did a lot of work on poisonous plants. If you're new to a country and you don't know what the plants are, and your stock are dying in the paddock before your very eyes, you think that horse is being poisoned. So what people would do, they would go around the paddock, pick the plants that they'd seen the horse eating, send it to Patrick Robertson Gordon, the Chief Inspector of Stock. He would give it to Bailey, who would work out what the plant was. Bailey would give the plant to either one of Brisbane's doctors who were skilled in chemical analysis, or he would give the plant to Carl Steiger, who was the government's chemical analyst, or he might give it in later times to the Department of Agriculture's chemical analyst, J.C. Brunnett. And what was happening is that the doctors were skilled in the ability to analyse the chemicals in a plant, and they had access to the published knowledge about which chemicals were dangerous. Now, again, I've chosen a plant at random, Gastrolobium, because it occurs across large parts of Australia. Gastrolobium definitely killed animals. Not all the plants that people reported killed animals. Bailey would say, that one's okay, you've got the wrong plant. But this one definitely did. The problem is that a lot of the gastrolobiums were not, a lot of the species were not dangerous. Some gastrolobiums were dangerous some of the time. Some gastrolobiums had poisonous seeds and flowers, but if there were no seeds and flowers on an old plant and there were old leaves, the old leaves weren't dangerous. And when Steiger analysed this plant, he said, I can't find it a dangerous chemical in it. What's going on? And they thought, well, maybe when a plant is dried as a specimen, it loses its poison. And modern science confirms that. Gastrolobium contains fluoroacetate. Fluoroacetate is currently used to make the poison 1080. But I'm from the land, and I know that 1080 is used to kill wild dogs. But 1080, theoretically, when it hits the ground, when it becomes dry or wet, it loses its poisonous quality. So they were right, but they were also right to warn people to get rid of gastrolobiums if they found them on their property. The search for pharmaceutical plants was actually another area where Australian botanists failed. The problem is that colonial nations knew that the colonies had plant material which was useful for pharmacology. They just didn't know which plants were useful and how they could be used. And everybody draws on the story of malaria and the cinchona plant. Malaria killed people. They knew from 1820, from this 18th century, that you could get a bark of a cinchona tree from Peru, and that you could make a tincture from that bark, which alleviated the symptoms of malaria. So what happened was agents would go and buy that bark quite expensively until Kew Garden said, better idea, why don't we steal plants and seeds and grow it ourselves and save a mozza? So they did that. So while cinchona was being planted in India to create the raw material for quinine, colonial botanists were saying, I wonder if we've got a plant which will work against malaria in our land. So Bailey and Hill went looking for plants, and they did it by looking at the literature and saying, okay, so these plants have the alkaloid that we want. These plants in Australia are called such and such. Let's experiment with them. And it was Walter Hill who suggested two plants, the quinine bush and the bitter bark. And it was the bitter bark that took Joseph Bancroft's fancy. He was one of the doctors who was skilled in analysis of plants. So Bancroft said, yes, there is element of quinine in this plant, and he showed it at international exhibitions. So the hunt was on. Let's get quinine out at home, let's manufacture it here, and let's do it by finding lots of bitter bark plants, planting them in plantations, and exporting the resulting quinine. By this time, the Indian plantations had come online. They were producing industrial quantities of quinine, and that quinine was being produced in factories, which Queensland could not compete with. So Bailey still mentioned Alstonia constrictor, the bitter bark, in his catalogues. He said, if you get some of that bark and make a tincture of it, it will alleviate fever. In the end, though, he had to say, maybe the best use for Alstonia is hops. It'll make good beer. So some of the explorations came up with a null result. Didn't stop them looking. Food plants, now there you do speaking. And here we meet a chap called Archibald Meston, who loved exploring across Queensland looking for plants that could be developed for food. Archibald Meston gathered a pepper, a garcinia, and I've eaten it, it's good, and the finger lime, Citrus australasica. But botanists and horticulturalists already knew about Eugenia and Davidson's plum. Remember, Bailey had experience with nursery work. He was a horticulturalist. He knew how to cultivate plants, and he knew how to get the best out of these plants. He didn't believe that people should plant seeds because he said they never come true. You never get a good plant from seed. He said we need to actually improve plants, and you do that in the way you use the soil, in the way that you graft plants, in the way that you cross-fertilize plants, in the way that you develop them. And in this work, he was supported by the Department of Agriculture's food expert, A.H. Benson. They believed that you had to graft a lot of plants to get the best. That didn't stop settlers from copying the work of overseas specialists. Luther Burbank in California took the cross-pollination, the development of plants through grafting, layering, budding to a fine art. And some of his plants are eaten and grown in Australia today. Bailey and his friends knew the work of Burbank, and they were fascinated by the science that allowed them to improve native plants. But Bailey's theory was, and Benson agreed with him, that Australian rootstock for a particular kind of plant had been developed to withstand the problems of the climate, whereas European plants would actually give you better fruit, bigger fruit, more luscious fruit, more delicious fruit. Unfortunately, colonists were tempted to use seeds and grow their own. And I'm a great fan of Tom Petrie, who was befriended by the Turrbal people and went to the Bonyi Festival, the Bunya Nut Festival up in the Bunya Mountains. And there he saw what you could do with Australian nuts. And he grew them at his home at Marumba near Petrie. His son, Walter Rollo Petrie, was also a forester. He actually was one of the first forestry department people to pitch camp with the team on Kagari, on Fraser Island. But he saw the macadamia nuts that his father had planted, and he saw a robust tree. And he said, why don't we get better nuts from this tree? It should be doing well. It should be a great fruiter. And the answer is that the macadamia nut doesn't often grow well from seed. You can't often get the fruit that you want. You don't get the yield that you want. So he followed the work of Burbank, and he started cross-pollinating, grafting, and trying to create a version of the macadamia tree which could be used for planting in orchards to create an industry in Australia. He also imported pecans from America, but not to cross-pollinate with the macadamias, to create a rainforest environment for the macadamia trees in his orchard. Ferdinand von Muller in Victoria collected the first of Queensland's macadamias, Macadamia ternifolia, which is still the main source of macadamias in the world today. It has been bred and improved over many long years. Bailey actually collected 3 more macadamias, and being a colonial botanist, he gave them all names. He said they're all distinct species. They're not. Modern science says, actually, they're all Macadamia ternifolia, so those names have been lost. That's what all the botanists did. That's the macadamia growing in my garden. A lot of us have macadamias, and mine actually fruits very well. The problem is that macadamias internationally are a creation of American orchardists. They were developed from a few seeds, which went, I believe, first to Hawaii and then to California. And they have been developed over many years to have a thin shell that's easy to crack, delicious fruit, and not to fall prey to disease. So the macadamias that are grown around the world and in Australia are actually macadamias with a low genetic diversity. They are vulnerable to all kinds of disease, to changes in climate, to problems caused by being grown in large plantations. And as a result, Australia realises that our macadamia plantations are at risk. And in 2012, the Australian government developed a National Recovery Programme. And that programme also has a keen group of supporters. The Wild Macadamia Conservation Trust, if you go to Amamore, there's a walk you can do to see wild macadamias, because they want us to maintain the wild plants that grow from seed as a hedge against the loss of the developed plants. Which brings me back to Walter Hill. You go into the Botanic Gardens, go into the rainforest section, head towards the river, and that tree's there. That is a wild tree. That tree maintains the genetic biodiversity which may be necessary to sustain continued growth of macadamias. Bailey and his colleagues were right. We had to develop our native plants, but we also need to keep native plants in their wild state, in their natural habitats, as a hedge against problems in the future. Okay, what Bailey loved more than anything was ferns. And he was tapping into a 19th century mania for ferns. People couldn't get enough of them. He actually famously stated that there's not a house in Brisbane which doesn't have a fern that's either alive or dead. We all know how to kill ferns. And he set out to tell people about the ferns that were available and how to grow them. And he said, you need to go out into the wild. You need to look at where they grow. And he actually, this is where I first met Bailey, on Mount Cootha. I was trying to find out what the plants were in the 19th century on Mount Cootha. And there's Bailey taking me for a walk over Taylor's Range and saying, this is how you dig up a fern, this is how you take it home, and this is how you care for it at home. I'm thinking, what? You want me to pick up ferns from the wild? Different times, different habits. So he tried to get people to learn about the ferns and in the process to learn about botany. And he did that by using images in his publications. And he published a lot about ferns, and these are just 4 publications. In 1874, his own drawings show ferns. In 1881, he's got the government printer to make the drawings and to lithograph them. In 1892, he's got a nature print, which shows the print in more detail. But in 1913, in his last book, he's got a lot of images created by his grandson, C.T. White. And C.T. White learnt about plants by drawing them. He produced thousands of images, and they're all in that book. And he also dared to use photographs. Well, this was Bailey moving into the future. So he wanted people to be able to recognize the plants that they were looking at. He wanted people to love plants as he did. And he found a comrade who also taught people how to love plants. Ellis Rowan was a decorative artist. She was not a botanist. When she painted a plant, she used to go out, pick them from the wild, take them back, paint them overnight before they got old and withered, and then go to Ferdinand von Muller in Melbourne and say, what plants are these? And he would tell her. She painted 12 images for this last book of Bailey's, the complete catalogue of Queensland plants. And I think the reproductive quality is pretty rubbish, but they are good paintings, you can see that. And he named this plant for her. He gave her the gift of eponymy. He gave her a name on a plant. This is the ground orchid, Phaeus grandifolius, variety Rowani. And he looked at this picture and he said, the spots on the petals, never seen that before, must be a new plant. So he named it for her. Problem. Nobody ever found a Phaeus that looked like that. So she had obviously taken some liberties with her picture of the plant. And eventually that plant was disallowed, and Phaeus grandifolius no longer has a variety Rowani. But let's give Ellis Rowan her due. She made people love plants. At a time around Federation when people are saying, what does it mean to be Australian? She showed them Australian plants. And she travelled around Queensland collecting plants. She got to know a lot of people. One of the places she went was to Somerset to visit Francis Jardine, Frank Jardine. She was invited up there and she stayed with the family. And they took her touring around and she painted the plants of far north Queensland while there. The Jardines had already sent picture plants down to the Queensland Acclimatisation Society. And when Bailey saw one growing in their hothouse, he said, oh, this is a new one. And he named it Nepenthes Rowani, F.M. Bailey, for Ellis Rowan. And he named another one, Nepenthes Bernaysiae, for Louis Bernays, who was the leader of the Acclimatisation Society. The Jardines kept sending him plant specimens because they were keen naturalists and they knew what they were doing. But they also invited him to Somerset to have a look-see. And when he got there, Sanna Jardine took him to a place, Polo Creek, where he found a beautiful Hoya that he named Hoya Sanna for Mrs. Jardine. He also found a lot more pitcher plants. And he named one for Frank Jardine, one for his daughter Alice, so you're looking there at Nepenthes alici, and a pitcher plant for his son Chumley. We've got a pitcher plant, Nepenthes chumleyi. Unfortunately, this is the way botany works. Taxonomy has very strong rules. Colonial botanists tend to see minute differences that enable them to give a new name to a plant and create new species. When those plants are put in front of the community of botanists, they tend to say, no, one plant. All of the plants that I've just shown you, the pitcher plants, are just one species. So I'm sorry, the Jardine family has lost its name on the pitcher plants. Jardine was just one of the people who hosted Bailey on his plant collecting expeditions. He always complained he didn't get out enough, he didn't get to see plants in their natural habitat. But he did have a gang of mates that he could go plant hunting with on a regular basis. This was the Field Naturalist group of the Royal Society. It was formed in the 1880s as a democratic group, and somehow, overnight, Bailey became its leader. Probably because he knew plants and he was willing to tell people what they were looking at. So this image shows a weekend away up at Landsborough in a guest house. You probably can't pick which one is Bailey or who the other people are. One of them